and finished product on the continent. So we have two co-conveners for this session, in addition to several panelists that will be joining this engaging session. I want to invite the two co-conveners. I believe everyone has joined online and we're ready to go. We have our first co-convener is Dr. Trevor Munder, who is President of Global Health at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We also have another co-convener, Dr. Richard Gordon, and he's the Executive Director of the Grants, Innovation and Product Development Unit at the MRC, Medical Research Council in South Africa. So I believe that both co-conveners are online. I'm going to turn to them and ask that they get the panel started.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. This pandemic has really been plagued by issues of commodity access. A lot of the discussion has been around vaccines. Therapeutics have been less of an issue and less of a utility, except for dexamethasone so far. But this has changed recently with the advent of two innovative molecules, molnupiravir and Paxlovid. I've been very pleased that we've been able to augment the activities of the Medicines Patent Pool and others to look at early access for these compounds in Africa. Another narrative played out last year, which was around one of the false starts when it was identified that potentially a malaria drug, hydroxychloroquine, might actually work against COVID. And there was literally a run on the supply of that, and we had to look at actually buying API in order to prevent a shortfall in that critical malaria compound. Which brings us to the specific focus today, which is around API manufacturing in Africa for malaria drugs. If we look at the recent malaria numbers, which were revised, we have 630 million deaths from malaria annually, most of those in sub-Saharan Africa, and there have been tragically 70,000 excess deaths related to COVID. So what a tragedy if any of the critical compounds in treating malaria would experience a shortfall for reasons of supply security and in fact just the location of supply in terms of where the greatest need is. So we have a great panel today that is going to consider this topic. Some old and new friends, Professor Kelly Chibali, Dr. Tumi Samedi. But I'm going to turn it over to Richard to give us a few thoughts and to introduce the broader panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. And thank you very much to the members of the audience and to the esteemed panel. It's really great to have you together at this meeting. Now, we know it's a vaccine meeting, but sitting at the southernmost point of Africa, I can tell you access of supply doesn't only apply to vaccines. As Trevor mentioned in the opening remarks, if drugs were in short supply in many times the area, reagents for machines and machines themselves. So, and obviously the element of diagnostics. So this session was really the culmination of a lot of discussions that have been going on between African member states and governments, really trying to build on this incredible momentum that the African CDC have achieved around the supply and manufacture of vaccines. And to see whether this is the time now to be building on that, to be looking at therapeutics, whether they're API or finished product on the continent. And essentially the goal of the session is to talk around the concept of launching a call for proposals, initially targeting malaria, but malaria, an entity is not going to be sustained by malaria. And then to really be looking at the other drugs that are going to be needed, COVID drugs that Trevor mentioned earlier on, but also drugs of neglected diseases and antimicrobial resistance in Africa. So we have a very, very distinguished panel that I would like to introduce you now. We've got Dr. Merfin Mpundu, who's the Director for React Africa at the International Center for Antimicrobial Solutions. We have Professor Kelly Chibali, who's the founder and director of the UCT Drug Discovery and Development Center, and he's the Never Eisel Chair in African Center for Drug Discovery and Development at the University of Cape Town. We've got Dr. Charles Gore. We were very pleased to have Charles with us a little bit earlier today. Charles is the Executive Director at the Medicines Patent Pool, Geneva. We've got Ms. Carol Ruffle, who is head of the Joint Office for South Africa Drugs and Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDi, and the Global Antibiotic R&D Partnership called GARD-P. We have Mr. Pierre Hugo, who is the Senior Director for Access and Management at the Medicines for Malaria Venture, who will be talking to us about the malaria programs they're working on. And if technology allows, Dr. Tumi Semete, the CEO of SAPRA, will be joining us. Hopefully she'll be joining us in the next few minutes. She's had a power crisis at her home in Johannesburg, and she's looking to try and dial in from her phone. So that is the panel, and we're going to ask the panel some questions around this particular topic and really try and focus it slightly differently to what we had before. In the last couple of days, we've heard many of the very key elements that are involved in vaccine manufacturing going forward. The issue of pool procurement, the issues of regional regulatory harmonization, the issues around funding. Our goal is not to repeat those discussions because they've been quite well established in the last 2 days. We're really going to be talking at a grassroots level here about what is the need, what should we seek to achieve in the first pilot project, and to put some nuts and bolts there. So I'm going to kick off and ask you, Murphin, with your React Africa hat on, and you dealing a lot in antimicrobial resistance. You tend to work a lot with governments, representative organizations, civil society, and what have you experienced over the last year at a continental level, not just at a regional, but at a continental level, of the impact of supply chain around APIs and medicines, and what's your role, do you think, of the governments associated with that?
Thank you very much, Richard, and I'm pleased to join this distinguished panel and also the participants. I'll set the ball rolling. Unfortunately, in the African region, we do have chronic shortages and stockouts of quality assured medicines, including antibiotics, medicines that are used for cancer, non-communicable diseases medicines, and those medicines that we use in terms of neglected tropical diseases. We have millions of children that are dying because of lack of access to antibiotics and other commodities. There's a lot of fragility in the region, and some of the shortages are attributed to things like single sourcing, global supply chains that are weak and fragmented demand forecasting, procurement challenges, weak health systems, high prices, not enough qualified healthcare workers to recommend right medicines, and weak legislation and enforcement. But there's also weak industrial pharmaceutical training and other R&D disciplines. Most of the health systems in the region, unfortunately, we work in so many countries that health systems are poorly financed, and they experience challenges with lack of access to existing and new molecules being introduced on the market. Most African countries depend on importation of 80 to 100% of their pharmaceutical needs. And so the answer to the question, do we need local production to try and address some of these issues of lack of access, of pricing, of stockouts? And when you get some of these illnesses or diseases like cancer, it's more like a death sentence because there's no hope for most of the patients in the region. And needlessly to say that we have seen an increase in antimicrobial resistance that is propagated or that is fueled by overuse and lack of access. And we know for a fact that lack of access leads to more death in the region, and we have the highest burden of infectious diseases. There are some challenges that need to be addressed, and this is where the governments can come in and try and render some support and some solutions. Number one, we need to establish really pharmaceutical manufacturing hubs that concentrate on production facilities for key starting materials, drug intermediates, and active pharmaceutical ingredients. We require extensive incentive systems to support the companies. this is challenging for actually countries with smaller markets to reproduce such incentive structures unless there is extensive support from some intergovernmental organizations, but also our own governments. Even for entrenched countries like India, it has been a challenge to establish such facilities, primarily due to the cost advantages in China and tech transfer issues. We need to address, secondly, the competition from imported generic antibiotics and other medicines. We need policies that address the current bias towards imports, and large manufacturers would need to ensure local manufacturers realize a key return on their investments. And we need to regulate the importation of drugs into the region and secure market and incentives for local manufacturing. Thirdly, we need to create a conducive environment to establish manufacturing companies in most of the countries, including Kenya, that is actually a large producer of medicines in the region. Out of the 35 registered manufacturers, only 6 are manufacturing antibiotics, and only a narrow range, the beta-lactams. And some of the reasons of doing that is because of the high cost of actually, a WHO pre-qualification, which they find very expensive. And so we need to actually support that. And lastly, we need to focus on supporting and developing human resource capacity in research and development and other skills that are needed to really establish vibrant and robust manufacturing systems to strengthen our supply chain systems that will result in equitable access to for all medicines, not just looking at antibiotics. Thank you.
Trevor, you're on mute.
Of course. Kelly, maybe I turn to you now. And knowing your experience at H3D in terms of bringing the first innovative molecule for malaria that was actually discovered and developed on the African continent, I can only imagine some of the challenges in terms of that transition from the research discovery phase into the clinic. Maybe you can give us the story around how you were able to source the compound and how that worked out for you.
Thank you, Trevor, and thanks, Richard, also for the opening remarks. I'm actually delighted that Merfin went first, because I think he's really unpacked some of the critical issues that I would have loved to touch on, but I won't do that for the sake of time. I think let me start by really, and Trevor, I think in your question, your remarks, you mentioned the R&D aspect. And I think this is something we need to highlight very, very strongly. And I would like to say this before I actually answer your question, which is, I think for the audience and for everybody else to recognize that on one hand, we have the research and development, the R&D value chain, which I'm going to unpack very briefly now, on one hand. But this R&D value chain interacts with the manufacturing value chain. And if I go back to the R&D value chain, there are basically 4 components to remember. And Trevor was mentioning this in his introduction and also in the question to me. So the first block of this R&D value chain is a discovery phase. The next phase is the preclinical development phase. The third phase is the clinical development phase. And then the final phase, which probably most of us listening to this panel discussion are probably most concerned about, which is the registration and marketing value chain. So when people often think about manufacturing, they tend to focus a lot more on the registration and marketing aspect of the value chain. In other words, commercial production of the API. But I want to remind us that if I then take a step back, before we got registration and approval, there had to be manufacture of the clinical batch of material for the different phases of the clinical development, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And of course, because of the numbers involved, the scales ramp up as we go from phase 1 to phase 3. There is also, of course, the development of the processes and the formulation. And now to the third component, which is where the manufacturing value chain really kicks in, is that the preclinical development phase. And what we see there is, and I think Murphy was alluding to this in his introduction, is at the preclinical stage, we actually have to deal with chemical production, chemical manufacture of chemical intermediates that we need for scale up, to scale up material for extensive toxicological studies. And that is important to really log. And so what we see here in a nutshell is as the R&D value chain grows or expands, there are multiple opportunities created for the manufacturing value chain to emerge as well. Now, of course, manufacturing doesn't have to begin with R&D. However, R&D can really be, bring up the demand for manufacturing. Now to answer Trevor's question, this is the actual experience that we had, where going through the R&D value chain from discovery, we got a compound that we discovered. We then had to get to a stage where we needed to do the preclinical development. Amongst other things, we needed to scale up on the chemical intermediates to facilitate the research, but also scale up on the API so that we could do extensive toxicological investigations. Unfortunately, because we do not have local capability to do that, we had to outsource this to China and to India. When we eventually managed to nominate this compound to go into phase 1 human trials, we needed to produce 5 kilograms of clinical good manufacturing material. And again, once more, we had no capability to do this in Africa. Again, we had to outsource this overseas. Again, so in a nutshell, you see that we had to deal with the manufacturing challenges at the preclinical stage, and we had to deal with the manufacturing challenges at the clinical phase of the process. And if we had a local manufacturer, we could have saved on the time. Back to you, Trevor.
Thanks very much, Kelly. Maybe just your quick thoughts on the system that you mentioned. You'd have a local manufacturer, but how do you see that final value chain, the commercialization, the manufacturing, intersecting with the R&D process as we go forward? What is that really wished for future that we have?
I think that my wish for the future is, again, to look at this value chain as a continuum. Because if you try to address just one component and not the other, it's futile. It's going to be useless. So I think we're going to look at this as a continuum. And of course, we need to think about how we can fuel the pipeline of products to manufacture. I mean, Murphy was talking about some of the obstacles with our local governments not insisting on local manufacturing of the product. Is what we need is, of course, for example, now we're in a pandemic, we have to rely on our partners elsewhere. But long term, I think we're going to be able to fuel the pipeline so that we have R&D really interacting with manufacturing, because it's not just the patient at the end of the day, but it's also economies. I mean, the jobs that get created out of manufacturing, right at the preclinical stage, all the way through to marketing and approval is enormous. So that's my dream, Trevor, is that we can begin to see the value chain as a continuum and actually address everything as a continuum, not parts of it.
Makes a lot of sense, Kelly. Maybe I turn to Charles now. We've all been excited about these new compounds that have been coming out now for COVID, molnupiravir, Paxlovid in particular, and I'm sure there will be more. The medicines patent pool has a critical role and has been central to elements of access for those compounds. I wonder if you can update us on what's going on, and do you really see the role of the medicines patent pool as a model for how access may be created in Africa? And just to throw in as well, what do you see the role of World Health Organization pre-qualification in that entire process? So a couple of questions for you, Charles.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Trevor. And I'd like to call you out and the Gates Foundation and thank you enormously for your funding for Medicines for All and their introduction of a greatly improved manufacturing process for molnupiravir. that will significantly decrease the price, I think, for the finished product. So I think that's really great work that you've done there in supporting that. Yes, I mean, I think that, as you know, voluntary licensing a la Medicines Patent Pool really kind of started a decade or so ago and has really worked in HIV very well. It's more challenging in some other areas, and it becomes particularly more challenging once you get into biologics for a variety of reasons. But certainly when you're talking about the small molecules, I think that this, because it's a voluntary mechanism, because it's transparent, because the Medicines Patent Pool is a public health organization, were it not for the fact that WHO felt uncomfortable having licenses from the industry, we might well just be a project within UNITAID and therefore housed actually in WHO rather than a standalone organization. And I think that the willingness of industry to accept that in vaccines, really access has not been well done. And of course, Africa has been the primary example of an area of the world that has suffered so much. At least with the small molecules, they came to us and showed a real willingness to get this done. It's interesting, both of those licenses are very similar, cover the slightly different geographies. One covers 105 countries and one covers 95, but the population is almost identical at 4.1 billion. I do think that within public health, this idea of transparency is extremely important, because obviously there have been a lot of bilateral licenses going on in the vaccine space. And what that makes it very difficult for an organization like WHO, which is trying to coordinate COVAX, to do if they cannot see the terms of some of these agreements. And by being very transparent, I think that is hugely beneficial. And of course, our licenses are also non-exclusive, which means that hopefully we generate the competition that drives down prices to what is the lowest but still sustainable level. In other words, the generic companies are still making profits, are still incentivized to go in and register and sell in those countries. I think that there's also you asked about whether quality is important in this. And we think it's extremely important. And I would just like to say that the way that the process works is when we get a license and sign it, we immediately open a call for expressions of interest from any generic manufacturing firm. And for molnupiravir, that process has closed and we've had over 100 applications. But what is sad is that too few of them are from Africa, and in particular from sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that indicates that the lack of capacity that both Murphy and Kelly have been talking about. And also, we expect to have, in fact, probably at least as many as that for the Pfizer drug as well. So, but again, probably too few from Africa. Even though we are looking to have as broad a geographic base of manufacturers as possible, and we're actually looking for manufacturers there, and we really spent a lot of time going out and trying to encourage people to apply. And Murphy, and I agreed with every single word you said, except for possibly one, and that was around the cost of PQ. The cost of PQ per se is not enormous, but obviously it's partly the cost of getting to that stage and the quality requirements to be able to do that. And we have had an internal debate for some years now about how important is quality. Is it really important that there should be WHO PQ? Is it acceptable to have potentially lower qualities in some parts of the world? And we have gone, no, absolutely under no circumstances can there be two levels of acceptability. There's quality and it needs to apply for everyone. And that means that in our licenses, we require either WHO PQ or the approval of a stringent regulatory authority. It doesn't have to be PQ, but in lots of cases, there's no other pathway for the generics. So we will continue to do that. And one of the things that we're looking at right now is how we can work with other organizations like, for example, the Gates Foundation and other working in this space to help with the upskilling of companies in Africa to make sure that we have at our next licenses in the future significantly more applications for licenses and significantly more licenses granted. We do not so far, we're just about to make some grants of licenses now, but so far we have not granted any licenses in our 12-year history to any African, sorry, to one African company. And that is really sad and really highlights exactly the problem that we're addressing today. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles. And I think that's a perfect segue into the next section, because this is exactly what the call is about, to try and generate a few more WHO quality assured facilities. So I'm going to go to Carol now. And Carol, the last 18 months has highlighted the inequities on the supply chains that you've seen more on AMR side. But can you highlight just some of the challenges that you have seen with the supply chain? And maybe make some of the recommendations building on what Murphin was saying, on the antimicrobial space and neglected diseases, and then we will head back towards malaria.
Thanks, Richard, and for the opportunity to be part of this important discussion. So let me start just talking about a case which I think we've been closely watching and with some concern that really illustrates Africa's vulnerability with regards to life-saving drugs, and in this case for the sort of vulnerable populations, neglected populations. And that's the case of amphotericin B, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. In India's last COVID wave, they had a related surge in a fungal infection, mucormycosis, usually quite rare, low numbers, and an infection that India can usually meet with its own domestic demand quite comfortably. So although there was a significant effort within India from the Indian government with manufacturers to scale up its production of amphotericin B, which is the first line treatment for this fungus, they really just couldn't meet that demand. And so there was a heavy reliance on importing the balance of the amphotericin B that they needed, be it in the liposomal form or deoxycholate. So this is the very same source that Africa uses to import to treat its neglected diseases, be it the visceral leishmaniasis or life-saving for cryptococcal meningitis patients. So I think while we didn't see a drastic shortage, when you look back to say, well, why couldn't India make enough? It really does again stem back to API shortages and shortages of the other critical components that go into make amphotericin B. And I've read around the synthetic lipids, which are now needed for the mRNA vaccines. So there's potentially these global shortages that will continue to plague the API and building blocks to put amphotericin B together, and keeps Africa at a very vulnerable situation because we're solely reliant on importation. Just a quick word then to pick up on Murphin's points about antibiotics. Clearly there's the essential antibiotics are plagued, and the frequency of shortages is only increasing, and this unleashes a whole cascade of impact, whether it be directly on health outcomes or whether the contribution to AMR down the line, and sort of pummels us forward into a real crisis in years to come, where we start to imagine modern medicine without antibiotics. So I think a kind of a high-level recommendation, should we be starting to look as a continent at a particular focus around an EML list that we should be manufacturing and securing the supply of, or perhaps it's identifying that group of anti-infectives, antibiotics, which we already know are prone to global shortages, that we can start to build our own capacity and our own resilience. So thinking about that portfolio, that's going to pull us forward with security.
Thank you,
Richard.
Carol. Thank you. So now we're going to go back to malaria, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the experiences that MMB have had, and again, also linking to what Kelly was saying in terms of the early discovery through to API and clinical trial batches, but also in your malaria experience of the last kind of 18 months, and the kind of the impact that's had on the global supply chain, because a lot of the people in this auditorium have been thinking vaccines the last 2 years, but not a lot of people know what happened in the drug space. But in the malaria space, can you give us a couple of examples? And then I'd also like you to address a question related to what Murph and Charles were talking about, this in what people call this mythical WHO prequel. Is it that unachievable? And can you give a couple of case studies of what you guys are actually doing right now, which is kind of the basis for this whole idea of this call for Africa around WHO prequel?
Sure. Great to be on the panel, and I'll try and incorporate what some of my previous colleagues have alluded to or outlined. It's a long list. So in terms of impact, is considerable over the last 18, almost 2 years. I won't go through all of them. I'll just flag some of them. A lot of them have already been highlighted, but I think if we split it into upstream and downstream perspective, upstream being global and what's been affecting majority of the development of drugs or otherwise manufacturing. 99% of all the active pharmaceutical APIs or key starter materials come from China or India. All the key starter materials pretty much come from China. What we've seen is definitely increased pricing, shortage of supply. Trevor alluded to the hydroxychloroquine saga that we saw, where there's government hoarding, import-export bans. So in terms of where we currently stand, a lot of the antimalarial drugs are currently being tested for COVID. So these are drugs that are life-saving drugs in some case, being tested for potentially repurposed for COVID. So if we do see them start, results with them starting to work, that's going to create pretty much, or could have potential to create a sort of hydroxychloroquine rush on products, and that creates short supply and increased prices, and all those unpleasant market impact factors that we saw last year. So in terms of the downstream perspective, definite extended lead times. So if you think of the Global Fund, for example, they sea freight in all their products, anything from 90 to 100 days. So from when the orders get placed to actual delivery, that's a long lead time. So, if you've got a local manufacturer based in Kenya supplying within 1 or 2 days in Southern Africa countries or Eastern Africa countries, it goes without saying that's a huge advantage on having to wait an additional 100 plus days on sea freight. And globally, in terms of increased freight costs, lack in supply of containers, it's once again the list goes on. I think it's important though to say that there is a silver lining. I think it's resulted in a much closer working and collaboration amongst partners. It's forced us, as Kelly was saying, to look at the full manufacturing process. So the full value chain, as he put it, so end to end. So, absolutely having all the information on where does the key starting material come from, how many manufacturers manufacture that key starting material, understanding where those risks are, pricing. I think huge kudos to Global Fund, President's Malaria Initiative, the Gates Foundation, many other organizations that have played an integral, a very important role, from the global community in engaging and looking at what kind of strategies we can put in place to risk mitigate. Local manufacturing is one of them. So, again, towards malaria, you asked the question, is WHO pre-qualification achievable? Yes, absolutely. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I think the timelines on average, you're looking at about 18 months, which includes development activities, includes the BE studies, stability data, before that submission to WHO pre-qual. I think I would flag that it's tough. It's not easy. So if we look at the 375 drug manufacturers in the continent, serving 1.3 billion people, there are only 5 pre-qualified manufacturers. So I think what's absolutely key in getting it right, though, is having that willingness of partners or willingness of manufacturers. And what I mean by that is that strategy, that local manufacturing strategy or African manufacturing strategy needs to be embedded as part of their business strategy. What's been great, we've definitely seen a willingness from quality approved manufacturers to invest in tech transfers, turnkey projects, vertical integration projects. It's exciting. A great example is IMSOR, one of our manufacturing partners. We're working with IMSOR and SUFA in Nigeria to help get them WHO pre-qualified for sulfadoxine pyrimethamine to protect pregnant women and infants. So we're also working with IMSOR in Kenya. What's great to see is they've actually gone ahead and done a turnkey project with the biggest API supplier in the world, Mangalam, to manufacture key APIs for malaria and other drugs. So that in turn ensures supply security. It enables them to have better control on pricing and obviously supply, and then enables them to be regional and supply the region. So maybe I'll stop there and hand it back to you.
Yeah. So before I hand to Trevor, so really the ultimate goal of this program is, can we go from 5 WHO pre-qual manufacturers to 10 in the next 2 years? And that's very much the goal of what we're looking to do here, to see if we can, and not only just finished product, but API as well, and using the African CDC and the magnificent progress they made on vaccines to be able to do this in the drug space. Trevor, unfortunately, Chimelo, she's had IT issues with power at her house, so she is listening, but she can't talk. So would you like to take a few of the questions? Or are you happy for me to carry on, Trevor?
Yeah, why don't you carry on? It was going to be important, and maybe it will come up, the question of what are the criteria for the selection of the hubs that the Africa CDC and partners will be selecting. And I think that we'd have to come back to Tumi at some point in terms of what would be the criteria around, for instance, the regulatory competencies in the region.
Thanks, Trevor. So maybe I'm going to open that question to the panel. So if the goal of this program is to initiate regional hubs for manufacturing either finished product or APIs, and you were on the selection panel, what are the key things that you are advising that need to be considered when selecting partners? So we're thinking potentially there could be some situations where it's a greenfield, where nothing actually exists, or in other circumstances where existing companies are actually making a lot of product, but they just need that last hurdle over WHO pre-qual. So maybe I'm going to go to probably you first, Charles, because you got lucky the first time getting the question third, and then I want to go to Kelly, so you time to think, Kelly.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Yes, I mean, there are many aspects to this, obviously, and it's not necessarily I come at it from a slightly different angle, in a way, with MPP. But one of the, clearly regulatory strengthening is absolutely critical to this. And so I think is some kind of coordination about this. I'm not sure that I think a free-for-all is necessarily going to produce the most sustainable outcome. I'm also very, I would like to think that there could be as much interdependence built in as possible, so that, you know, if this is possible, and of course, you know, so much of the raw materials are actually sourced from China and so on, but the amount of things that could be produced locally in one country and moved to another for the production of API, and from the API maybe to somewhere else for the finished products. Because I think always at the end of the day, there's going to be this issue of who is going to buy this and who is going to buy the product if, at least initially, it's more expensive than, for example, the cheapest Indian products. And making sure that works requires a lot of political commitment. And a lot of that political commitment can often be best served by interdependence between countries.
Dr.
You know,
John
we've seen with the vaccines what
CDC,
Mr.
Really
the unavoidable
Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade
that comes in emergency
area,
situations.
Dr.
And trying to
African Union Special Envoy
mitigate
the African
that, I
Medicine
think
Agency.
is helpful.
Honorable
and then
ladies and gentlemen,
in terms
good
of
morning.
Of quality.
Your Excellency, my name is Noela Bigimana,
yes, it's,
and I'm the Division Manager
this
for
does
Research,
require
Innovation and Data
significant
Science at the
commitment,
Medical Center.
But
and
it's about understanding, I think, that this is a prerequisite, that this isn't kind of something negotiable.
That we review the progress made in implementing the partnerships
in some respects,
for
this
Africa
is very
vaccine
negotiable
manufacturing,
when companies are
this two-day event
simply
is
providing
hosted
for
in
their
Kigali,
local
Rwanda,
market. They're not engaging with the big buyers that would require it,
and beyond.
And
the meeting is
countries, when
convened
they
by
are
the
buying,
African
are
Union,
not requiring
the
it.
Africa CDC,
So again, the political
the EU Development
will
Agency,
to make this happen
and the African
is really, really important. But the regulatory strengthening, which is really not my area of expertise,
it is
and I'm sorry,
now my
extreme pleasure
to welcome the guest of honor,
is critical. I think we have
to give the
just two national regulatory authorities in sub-Saharan Africa who are maturity level 3, and they are not actually even maturity level 3 for vaccines. I mean, I know we're not talking about vaccines here, but in other words, they're not complete maturity level 3. As I understand it, South Africa is being assessed at the moment. But again, it's about the need for government to prioritize regulatory strengthening. And again, this is all about, underspend on health generally, and hopefully that will change just a little bit with this idea that, the pandemic has shown that health is not a cost, it's an investment. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. So my interpretation is it's a very important consideration where you put up is how advanced the regulator is. Thank you. Kelly, over to you.
And gentlemen. Thanks, Rich, and thanks for giving me the chance to think. Well, first of all, I think the first consideration, of course, is always, where are the laws that we can build on immediately? In other words, something to upgrade. All things being equal, I would really consider 3 things. And I think I'm going to table them in this order. And I really just want to pick up on what Charles mentioned about the regulatory environment. I really would consider a regional hub, and a regional hub in a region where there is already pre-existing regulatory harmonization in that region. So I'm not representing TUMI, but I used to be on the SAPRA board until I stepped down recently. I think one of the business cases for SAPRA is exactly this, not just mutual recognition, but also regional harmonization. One can give the example of Zazibona. So the regulators in these countries have harmonized this environment. So that for me will be a major consideration. But secondly, it's not just the harmonization at the regional level, but it's a capacity to handle doses. This is a major issue. Skills. I think amongst other things, are really our Achilles heel. it's a skill, the
This
capacity
joint effort
to handle these
has
things here
helped
is really lacking. So
to
I would
prevent
look at
Africa
the
from
harmonization at the
being
regional
yet
level
again
and look at the capacity issue.
an NAFTA
Secondly,
force.
I would look at
But we still have a
what are
lot
the trade barriers. If you
of
locate a
work
hub in some region,
to do.
that makes it difficult for them to
Africa's
export
challenges
those products to another
during
country.
the
That's an issue
COVID
because then
pandemic
even if
in
they're able to
securing
manufacture, but because of
time access to
export
tests,
import regulations, if that is a barrier, that I think will score very strongly in favor of
and
a country that I
vaccines
perceive
have served
to have a good system
as
in
the
terms of trade
constant
barriers. And then finally,
reminder
I would look at
that we need
procurement. How
to
quickly can they
be
procure whatever
doing
is
things
needed to do that?
for
Because that is a big
ourselves.
factor. We see it in R&D, but I think Murphy was
This
also
is
alluding
not
to this
a
earlier.
new
So that will be a third consideration.
problem.
The regulatory
But the
environment,
crisis
the
of public
capacity,
health
trade
is
barriers,
literally
and finally, but not least,
a matter
the
of
ability
life
to procure reagents and
and
chemicals
death.
as soon as possible. Back to you.
Thank you,
Africa
Kitty.
must therefore
Thank you. I'm
build
loving the completely different
manufacturing
angles that we're getting on the
and
discussions
scientific
from an IP
capacity
to a true
with
big
a
card-carrying
sense
chemist who's seeing it from the
of
completely the
urgency.
opposite side of the spectrum. So,
We
Carol, I'm
can
going
and
to you
must
next, and then to you,
do
Murphy.
something new
So you can be warm. But I think
and
this is really
different.
important. You're getting completely different views on the
And
same
when I say
issue.
we need to do
Because it's really
things
important
for
we get this right.
ourselves, that does
Thanks,
not
Richard. So
put
I
me
want to put an appeal
acting
out there
alone.
for not just the low-hanging fruit, but where our
Vaccine
real risks are
research
lying. And, you know,
and
coming back to this
production
idea of antibiotic
is
security.
fundamentally
And can we leverage
global
something with our vaccine
enterprise.
capacity that's being built? Given that
We
many
therefore have to
antibiotics, particularly
in
in
a
the beta-lactam
partnership
phase, does mean a sort of a
with
green field. We don't have
each
beta-lactamase
other
facilities
as
on the
Africa,
continent at all
and
in terms
also
of being able to manage, you know, it
with
needs a
key
special set
partners
of environments to stop
around the world.
cross-contamination. But given that many of these beta-lactams will
That
be injectable
requires
and need that finish
not
and
only
fill sterile
funding,
type
but
of environment,
also,
you know, I don't know, can we
and
be
even
leveraging
more
something there as we
importantly,
start to build finish and fill
trust.
capacity for vaccines? Let's
One of
explore
the
that because we
most
don't want to be
important
building,
developments
and with
since
today's technology, I'm
our
sure
last
there are
meeting
you know, much easier ways
is
to
the
put
entry
in
into force
barriers to stop
of the new
cross-contamination, etc.,
African
than when we were
medicines
looking at beta-lactam facilities 40
agency.
years ago, where we
I
really didn't have
commend
that kind of technology to stop
the
the
African
cross-contamination. So my appeal
Special
is like,
Envoy,
what can we do
Dr.
to leverage the finish and fill
Michel
sterile environments
Sidibe
that we're building for
for
vaccines?
his role in accelerating.
Thanks, Carol. That's great.
this
So,
process.
Murphy?
Yes, thank you so much.
It
And
is essential
before I actually answer your
to
question,
maintain
I'll go
the
back to
momentum
Charles. I'm completely
and
with you on
fully
quality.
establish
There has to be
this
no
agency
compromise.
without
But I think the fact that there are
which
only
Africa
5 killed on
cannot
the continent, I
independently
think supports
and regulate
my point and view. And
medicines
most manufacturers actually
and vaccines.
say that the whole process is really
Producing
quite intense
vaccines
in
on
terms
our
of time and
continent is
investment. And
also
so I think
an
we just need to
opportunity
balance that. I mean, to
for
assure that we
trade
move towards that.
and
Thank you so much. And I
investment.
think, you know,
That's why
all
the
my colleagues, I
presence
think
here
you've
of the
addressed
Secretary General
key fundamental
African
areas. And I knew that
Continental
Kelly was
Free
going to actually
Trade
talk more on
Area
the
Secretariat
areas around
is so crucial.
around technology, the APIs. I think that
Rwanda and
there are
Senegal
just a
have
couple of
concluded
additions that I would make. I
agreements
think
with
among the
BioNTech
considerations that
to
I would
begin
be
the
looking at, the other
end-to-end
points that I had
production
have been mentioned, but I think one of them is that when we look at the regional economic communities and a very successive program that actually Kelly mentioned as Ebola. I think it's unfortunately is that, I mean, some regions, they've not moved fast along in terms of harmonizing regulation and how these products are going to move from one hub to another hub. And I think that definitely becomes a very key consideration. There is the area of data. I think harvesting, you know, we need to get those low-hanging fruits. And, you know, how do we share data? You know, how is data, the issues around protections, you know, how are those issues going to be handled? And I think one of the areas that in as much as we're looking at, you know,
These
we're
and
more
other
looking at
initiatives
new
underway
molecules
in
here
various
when we talk about like
countries
antibiotics. But I think
are
one of the areas
evidence
that
of the strong
we need to focus on in
momentum
consideration of
which
the hubs is that, you know,
must be
the products that we focus on should
supported and
not only be the new molecules, but the current ones that are really out of stock, that we
because
are
of
really
this,
suffering from, we are bleeding from, they are
terrible
not available.
pandemic.
So we just need to keep the
An
eyes
opportunity
on that.
has
And
been
also,
created
of course, I
to
like actually
fundamentally change the
Kelly's
pharmaceutical
explanation of the continuum.
landscape
I think we
on our
need to
continent.
take that sort of approach. But those, I think, are the two
This
areas that I
window
think I would, I would comment on. And also looking at some of the libraries that we already have, you know, as some failed products, or
now
that we tried a few years ago. Maybe there's potential, and so we don't need to start all over again. And so I think those are some of the areas that I think would be good to consider, you know, as we select the hub, or as we actually even look at the way forward for the hubs to actually create some sustainable answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Mervyn. And Pierre, before I hand to you, you raised a very interesting point. And in South Africa, I chair the API cluster for the South African government. And when I was getting involved in the program, everyone had this idea that we're going to make these mega blockbuster drugs and import replacements and all this stuff. The reality is those are very difficult to come by, and the scaling that's needed. The other reality is there are many drugs out there, that pharmaceutical companies, that the market's actually too small for them to be interested in. So a $300 million drug or a $200 million drug that they're actually not sure whether they can actually continue at all, that's the perfect kind of product that could come to Africa if it is in high need. And, you know, so we always need to be thinking about the low-hanging fruit in terms of those getting the drugs that we always need. I really like that angle. And Pierre, coming back to malaria, which is going to be kind of like the focus for the first kind of call, Charles raised a comment around about interrelatedness around about markets and suppliers of building blocks and reagents. You know, in the malaria space, you know, it's something that I've heard mentioned in the past. For something like this kind of program, would you make the local suppliers a key criteria? And do local suppliers exist for antimalarials? I think it's a key question. Suppliers of building blocks.
Yeah, good question. In terms of, you know, the criteria that we use, I was quite jealous when Charles said they had, you know, over 100 applicants for some of their expression of interest. It's a similar challenge with us when we put out an RFP to identify new manufacturers for a particular funded project. And the sulfadoxine pyrimethamine project is a good one. We have very few African manufacturers submitting proposals. So much so that in Nigeria's case, we had to sort of actively go out and canvass and, you know, work with WHO Prequal, UNIDA to see what, you know, which manufacturers had been audited or reviewed. So, you know, totally in agreement that is a challenge. However, there's once again, I just want to reinforce there is a willingness. Manufacturers do see the benefit of getting WHO pre-qualified, and, you know, 100% aligned with Charles's comments on quality. You know, I don't think we should for a second be saying, well, you know, we can have different standards for African patients versus other countries. So in terms of, you know, the ranking or criteria that we go through to help identify manufacturers, we look at, you know, do they have a market access capacity to be able to fill and meet, you know, global funders' needs, like Global Fund or PMI? Do they have a strong distribution? I think Kelly touched on that. You know, how strong is the existing? At a minimum, they need to be regional. You know, just moving anything from west to east in Africa, whether it's a human or you know, medicine, is a challenge. So, you know, having a West Africa hub, I think is critical or key. Some of our manufacturers, like the FirstSun Group, have already identified that. They've got plans to do the Greenfield project in Abidjan. They've procured the Trident Group to do their distribution throughout the continent. So it's you know, once again, not one size fits all, but it's looking for where those sort of sweet spots, looking for where those partners that it's part of their strategy, that there is that willingness. You know, looking at where you can reduce those risks in terms of supply or interruptions or delays. And once again, you know, whether it's a greenfield project I think typically lots of the conversations we have with manufacturers are sort of 30-70% investment split is more than welcome, or is the approach that they take. So the herd money you're putting on your venture capitalist perspective is definitely there. They don't want a free ride, and they know that they're in it for the long haul, if you will. Okay. And I think lastly, just to round off with some examples, as you said, Quality Chemicals in Uganda, part of the CIPLA group. I was looking at some of their global fund allocations. That in terms of reward for getting pre-qualified, if you will, and being a quality approved manufacturer, they were allocated nearly just under 20% of the total global ACTs procured by the Global Fund last year. So, in excess of 25 million treatments of artemether-lumefantrine for 2020. So that in itself is great to see. It shows that the funders, local manufacturing is part of their strategy. They are thinking and continuously trying to see how they can improve that reward in innovation, that reward for local manufacturing. Two other examples. Artemisinin is the raw material that's used for a lot of the anti-malarial drugs. There's only one manufacturer supplier of the vegetal artemisinin outside China, and that's based in Madagascar. So in terms of their intentions, their strategy, they want to do forward integration from artemisinin to artemether, so taking it from raw material to an API. And currently, the Nigerian manufacturers that are already procuring that API, some even Indian manufacturers. So having it all contained within Africa, I think is definitely possible. It's just being able to scale up and get that sort of the critical, manufacturing capacity to ensure that it's profitable for the manufacturers.
Thank you, Pierre. So panelists, we have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to quickly summarize before handing over to Trevor, if that's okay. I want to thank you all for your time, but essentially there are a lot of key messages that are coming through. Again, in all the cases with the vaccines, COVID is showing us that Africa really needs not just be making its own vaccines, but its diagnostics, its drugs, its reagents for its kits, et cetera. It very much aligns with the African CDC strategy around treatment, vaccines, diagnostics, and the pillars of the African CDC. A lot of the same messages have been coming out in this session for the last session. Kelly, you mentioned capacity development. Where are the people going to come from? The training, regulatory, harmonization, et cetera. So I'm going to thank you all. The goal of the session is to double the number of WHO pre-quality assured manufacturers in Africa. And thank you very much for your time. And over to you, Trevor, for the last 2 minutes.
Thanks, Richard. And my thanks to the panelists, to the Brains Trust over here for some very good ideas around this critical area. I think that with all the convenings around vaccines and just talking very generally around API manufacturing, honing it down to the use case of malaria is particularly pertinent. And I think it's achievable. It's going to require taking these set of ideas, putting them down in comprehensive plans and being sure that we move step by step. But look forward to engaging with all of you in exactly that process. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And back to the command control in Kigali. Thank you, guys.
Thanks all.
Cheers. Thanks for the opportunity.
Cheers. Thanks for the opportunity too. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much to the co-conveners and the panel. I think it's one of sort of the final sessions that we have for this meeting, but it's an important session because, as we heard, we talked about many of the key themes that have been coming and brought up by speakers since the very first day. So, we just heard of the importance of going beyond, as we look at the vaccine, but also looking at the diagnostics and therapeutics as well, and growing the readiness of local manufacturers to that end. So I think, I speak for many when I say that the past 2 days, I think, have been very, since yesterday day one and today day two have been very engaging. And I'm glad we have these recordings that we can refer back to, but I'm also glad we were able to bring together key stakeholders in these conversations. I wish we had more time to dive in depth into the many, I would say, broader topics that we've touched upon, and we would have had the opportunity to also hear or engage more and more with the hundreds that have joined us on Zoom and the more than thousands that have joined us on the other platforms. And I hope that we'll be able to keep engaging with many of you. So we're now coming to the closing. So it's the closing of the second day, but it's also the closing of this stakeholder engagement meeting. It's now a pleasure to welcome for this closing, official closing of the conference, Dr. Nikese Dembi, who will be sharing with us the learnings that, or sort of the key things that have come up during this time. And Dr. Nikese Dembi is within the Head Science Office, is also a senior advisor to the director of the Africa CDC, and is in the PAVM Secretariat. So I'll turn to you, Dr. Nikese, if you're ready. Okay.
Good. Thank you so much for really the insightful discussion we had for the previous, for the past 2 days. I'm going to provide, on behalf of Dr. John Pingasson, a summary of the discussions. His apologies, he has been traveling and is unavoidably absent. So please accept his apologies. A slide, please. Okay, so you recall we made a commitment in April, the 12th and 13th summit, to provide a framework for action that will guide our continental vaccine strategy. So in the next couple of slides, I'll provide some key highlights. Next slide. So the 12th and 13th April summit was quite successful, historical. Over 40,000 participants with the aim really of expanding Africa vaccine manufacturing to secure actually our global, for global health security. Next slide. So if you look at it closely, that's the journey. It's quite clear. The third and the fourth quarter, the framework for actions, we've so far generated a zero draft, which is ready, is currently under review by the scientific peer review group. And hopefully a version 1.0 we're going to be submitted to the Executive Council of the African Union and in February for endorsement to the head of state and government. Next slide. I think it's again, from this slide, you can see that there's still a momentum around vaccine manufacturing. If you look at it, day one, we had over 11,000 participants, and the day two, more than 5,000 on all the platforms, Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Next slide. I think this, again, a strong political commitment. You can see from the speech from His Excellency President Kagame. I think it's quite clear because of this terrible pandemic, an opportunity has been created to fundamentally change the pharmaceutical production landscape on our continent. Now is the time to act decisively and quickly together as Africa and also globally. That's His Excellency Paul Kagame from his speech yesterday. Next slide. So just to remind you a little bit on the focus and the major outcomes, expected outcomes from this meeting, this stakeholders meeting. One was to update, update on progress made so far on the Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing, agreed option for the regulatory mechanisms, identify the market shaping need, and then build on the momentum on the vaccine manufacturing in Africa. Just as a reminder also, this meeting is actually co-convened by the Udane part, Africa CDC, and then the AFCTA. So next one.
Do you know that
Yes, everyone. So I think look at it, please, next. Next, please click on that. So we have 8 key elements, established a coordinated approach so that we move in a very coordinated way, not fragmented in this, in implementing our vaccine strategy. Then the second is to ensure volume guarantees. Then the third one is to boost financing for local manufacturing, increase momentum of technology transfers. Then the second is to effective and harmonized regulation. Then the third one is to boost financing for local manufacturing, nurture and grow increase momentum of technology transfer infrastructure. Then the second is to effective and harmonized regulation. Then the third one is to boost financing for local manufacturing, nurture and grow increase momentum of technology infrastructure. Then the second is to effective and harmonized regulation. Then the third one is to boost financing for local nurture and grow increase momentum of technology infrastructure. This our work streams, and with Africa CDC playing a coordinating role to implement the continental strategy. Next slide. These are some of the key takeaways on this slide. So if you look at the continental strategy and delivery and oversight local perspective, so they are encouraging development for local players, including a rapid scale of production, increase R&D activity, adoption of the new technology to increase operationalized flexibility and production capacity on the continent. Second, strengthening the enabling environment will be required for help local manufacturers grow, I think, including promoting collaboration among manufacturers on the continent. So I think that's quite important, I think, as part of the P, that partnership that we all aim to achieve towards this initiative, continental initiative. So around the continental strategy delivery and oversight, from the international perspective, the continental strategy is critical to provide the required long-term perspective to vaccine manufacturing scaling and coordination across Africa. Major players, including Pfizer, J&J, Moderna, biotech, have demonstrated an interest in setting up shop in Africa, with some already having done so. We're quite, you're all aware of the J&J licensing that happened recently, and the development up to 2022 with Pfizer, and then Moderna statement and BioNTech in Senegal and Rwanda. So the international players will need a robust regulatory environment, that's agreed, and then the demand security and talent to encourage increased investment into the vaccine manufacturing ecosystem. Then international manufacturers are eager to support efforts to strengthen the vaccine manufacturing ecosystem and enablers, including talent development and the growing R&D. Next slide. So quite agreed on the African vaccine procurement pooling mechanism. We know the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust, which is the legal entity of the Africa Vaccine Tax Team and the MSP, have demonstrated the continent's ability to create the African-led solutions to meet the continental need in times of crisis. I think that's quite important, having African solutions to African problems to address what we all agreed on, the Africa we want. So that pool procurement mechanism used by AVAT has been able to, we've been instrumental in getting more than 500 million doses secured for the continent, but the 900 million doses that will be required. So the embedding vaccine regulatory, I think that's one of the most actually quite important, again, outcome of this meeting. I think it was quite interesting to have different views, but convergent at some point from the national regulators. So PFVM, I just want to again probably reemphasize there, we have a decision from the Executive Council to be really a coordinating instrument in terms of vaccine manufacturing, meaning pooling all the resources across the different work streams that I've initially stated to be able to achieve that continental aspiration of manufacturing at least 60% of vaccine by 2040. So the next slide will summarize a little bit clearly and very succinctly the different options we brought to the table, 5 options, but we all agree that 2 are really viable moving forward to fast track the regulatory component. Next slide. So these are the 2 agreed. The first one, an EUA, that's the emergency use process for locally produced COVID-19 vaccine, should be created as a harmonized EUA process through the African Medicine Regulatory Harmonization as a pathway for EMA. As EMA actually is fully operationalized, we'll still rely or strengthen capacity or EMRH to be able to achieve that, to be sure that our member state or AU member state will reach WHO maturity level 3. So on the second option, establish and strengthen a network of NRA from countries with intent to produce vaccines and NRAs that have achieved maturity level 3. I think for other products, the list, we have Tanzania, we have Ghana. If you bring together all the NRAs from our front runners, we create a network and then build on it with the expertise from the WHO, EMA, US FDA, I think we should be able to get the process done. That has been done. I think we have a case from Aspen. It's a very good example on the continent that we can all learn on. So next slide. So the other key takeaways around the vaccine technology and transfer and IP enabling established environment. So Africa needs really to focus on the transfer of second generation. We all agree there. I think we need tech transfer, but really for second generation vaccines. Then scaling technology transfers on the continent, at least we require building trusted partnership. That's the aim actually of PAVM. So the regional R&D, I mean the centers of excellence or capabilities and capacity centers, we all agree that definitely we need to establish partnership across the region to be able to achieve the continental aspiration. Then lastly, the vaccine manufacturing ecosystem, at least will rely strongly around some of the existing collaborations that have already been established with some of the financiers on the continent and the vaccine manufacturers to drive that process moving forward. Next slide. So the last session, session 10, there's a real need to ensure security of supply of drug API and finished product in Africa. It's quite, it was quite a consensus that on that point, sorry. This need has been heightened by COVID-19. We have to seize that opportunity. So investing in the regional API and finished product hubs are a necessity. I think then that the African CDC goal to lead that partnership to be able to drive that on the continent and also establish as we're moving forward on the vaccines, also hubs for oral therapeutics and APIs on the continent. Next slide. I think I'm not going to go into this detailed slide, but just to really reemphasize that you can see on the second line around the potential lead that it's a continental partnership across different stakeholders, including PAVM, AVAT, EMA, IMRH, EFCTA, to be sure that we meet or we implement the 8 bold programs. I think that's quite fundamental. That we agree that it's not a single institution that will be able to drive this initiative moving forward. Next slide. I think that, again, the political support, we've said, again, across the work streams. So we need some political commitment to be able to drive this. Essentially, using the instruments that are currently existing instruments, including EFCTA, now AMA coming to force there to be able to support the regulatory element. Next slide. I think I would like to end here by acknowledging all members of the work streams that are putting a lot of effort here, tireless effort to be sure that we generate this framework for actions. Next slide. Next, please. I think, again, it has been a long journey, over 7 work streams, more than 30 hours of workshop and summit, more than 100 hours of work stream working session, more than 60 hours of PLVM secretarial problem-solving time to come to generate this final product, or at least this near final product. Next slide. I think, thanks, and over to you, Murid.
I want to thank Dr. Nikiese for that great, great summary. And it's not easy to do at the end of a 2-day, intense 2 days. Thank you for taking us through the journey of the PAVM, for showing us the outcomes. So we came in with some outcomes and objectives, taking us through this framework and showing us how these key elements of PAVM are translated into the programs. And thank you for those key takeaways. And I do hope that we'll be able to share them widely with the audience that has been not only attending from the room, from here in Kigali, Rwanda, but also the thousands, as we saw the numbers that have joined us. So I want to thank the conveners. I want to thank the Africa CDC, the AU, the ODA, NEPAD, the AFCFTA. I want to thank the countless of people that have worked behind the scene, because we've seen some really good engagement, not only in terms of participation online, which shows that these conversations are needed. And so they're pushing us towards more action and fast tracking the work that's been done. There's also significant in-person participation, and I saw quite a few networking and collaboration and partnerships taking shape around the room. So at the conclusion of these 2 days, 10 sessions, and I want to thank the distinguished moderators that have joined us in the room and online, the distinguished panelists and speakers that we've had. I want to acknowledge the teams that have worked countless of hours to make this happen, the teams at the back and the translation as well, and everyone around the room and the teams online. And just to thank you for these discussions, and hopefully we keep this momentum going. So this is it. This is the end of day 2. It is not the end of the journey, which continues as we just mentioned. I want to thank you for those that are online. I don't think we have any further announcements other than these sessions have been recorded and will be shared or have already been shared by the Africa CDC communication teams. And just a last few logistics for those that are here in Kigali. Thank you for joining us. We will have, I think, more announcement at the front of the hotel, but there is a dinner that will follow this. And it's another opportunity to continue, engaging and networking, and the departure place will be at the front of the hotel. And I think at the reception at 6:30, which is coming quite quickly. And for anyone else that needs any support in terms of the tests, I know many of you are traveling, perhaps even tonight. Please let the people around the room know. So thank you again to everyone online. Thank you to those in the room, and we shall continue discussion. Thank you.